The era of uncontested U.S. dominance is over. Today, we face serious threats in China, Russia, and other nations determined to beat us in every single domain. What we're seeing from President Trump is a generational shift in policy, devoting our energies to responding to the rise of near-peer competitors like China.
U.S. Vice President JD Vance has announced what he calls a new era in military strategy. Vance unveiled this in a speech that he gave at the graduation of the U.S. Naval Academy. And some people have taken Vance's comments out of context to claim that supposedly the Trump administration is changing U.S. foreign policy to move away from warmongering and intervention to instead have a more restrained isolationist foreign policy. But that's not what's happening. If you listen to the full speech, and today I'll be playing clips, it becomes very clear that the Trump administration wants to go back to a blatant imperialism. And what they're changing is the Trump administration is dropping the pretense that U.S. foreign policy is motivated by so-called human rights or democracy promotion. JD Vance is making it clear that no, the U.S. empire is going to continue to wage wars and is going to act very aggressively and try to win those wars using overwhelming military force, but not in the name of so-called democracy and human rights, but rather in the name of extending U.S. imperial power and trying to maintain U.S. dominance in what Washington sees as U.S. imperial spheres of influence. JD Vance laments the fact that the U.S. empire has lost its unipolar dominance of the planet, and today it faces so-called threats from principally China.
In the wake of the Cold War, America enjoyed a mostly unchallenged command of the commons, airspace, sea, space, and cyberspace. But the era of uncontested U.S. dominance is over. Today, we face serious threats in China, Russia, and other nations determined to beat us in every single domain.
So this is not a return to isolationism, as some of Trump's supporters are claiming. No, on the contrary, JD Vance makes it very clear in the speech that the U.S. empire is preparing for more wars in the future. That's why the vice president was telling graduates at the U.S. Naval Academy that they should prepare for their mission in what he referred to as a new dangerous era with war on the horizon.
I also thought it would be appropriate to tell you a bit about how the president and I think of your mission in this new and very dangerous era for our country.
And what country exactly is the U.S. empire preparing for war with? Well, JD Vance again makes it very clear. He repeatedly mentioned China throughout the speech. He complained that the U.S. empire traded hard power for soft power, as he put it.
And so our leaders traded hard power for soft power.
And Vance argued that that was an error and that the U.S. empire should instead have been focusing on containing China.
So instead of devoting our energies to responding to the rise of near-peer competitors like China, our leaders pursued what they assumed would be easy jobs for the world's preeminent superpower.
Vance said that the U.S. empire took its eyes off the ball. He argued that it was a mistake for the U.S. empire to spend so much time waging the so-called war on terror and waging wars in the Middle East, in West Asia. Instead, JD Vance argued that the U.S. empire should have been focused on great power competition, i.e. conflict with China. And he said this pretty openly. He said that the U.S. empire should have been focused on a peer adversary, which, of course, is a reference to China.
Our government took its eye off the ball of great power competition and preparing to take on a peer adversary. And instead, we devoted ourselves to sprawling, amorphous tasks, like searching for new terrorists to take out while building up faraway regimes.
So what Vance is describing is what he calls a generational shift in policy. He's saying that the Trump administration is fundamentally changing the orientation of U.S. foreign policy.
What we're seeing from President Trump is a generational shift in policy with profound implications for the job that each and every one of you will be asked to do.
And Vance lays out a historical narrative in which, after the end of the First Cold War, the US was the uncontested global hegemon, a global empire, and there were no peer adversaries. So the US emphasized its soft power, especially its economic power. US corporations offshored production, and China became a global industrial power. And what Vance is complaining is he's saying that the US made a big mistake, and instead of trading with China as China was developing, he's saying that the US empire instead should have been isolating and containing and weakening China. And Vance says that it was a mistake to believe that by deepening US economic integration and trade with China, that China's system would change.
Now, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, our policymakers assumed that American primacy on the world stage was guaranteed. For a brief time, we were a superpower without any peer, nor did we believe any foreign nation could possibly rise to compete with the United States of America. And so our leaders traded hard power for soft power. We stopped making things, everything from cars to computers to the weapons of war, like the ships that guard our waters and the weapons that you will use in the future. Why did we do that? Well, too many of us believed that economic integration would naturally lead to peace by making countries like the People's Republic of China more like the United States.
This is a complaint we've heard a lot in Washington, that the US thought that it could, over time, overthrow the Communist Party of China and turn China into an obedient US puppet regime with, a capitalist government like in Japan. This is what the US did to Japan. They thought they could do it to China, but they failed. And now JD Vance is complaining about this and saying that the Trump administration is redirecting US foreign policy to prepare for war on China. So again, you need to consider all of this context when you hear supporters of Trump and Vance claim that they're moving away from warmongering and intervention in foreign affairs of other countries. That's not what's happening. In fact, JD Vance said it as clear as day in this speech. He said that when the US government sends these soldiers to war, they will have a clear mission in mind. When, not if, when they get sent to war.
We're returning to a strategy grounded in realism and protecting our core national interests. Now, this doesn't mean that we ignore threats, but it means that we approach them with discipline, and that when we send you to war, we do it with a very specific set of goals in mind.
What they're actually doing is they're going back to a kind of 19th century style blatant colonialism, and they're dropping the propaganda and illusion that US foreign policy is based on democracy and human rights and defending the rules-based international order. That was always bogus. It was always a lie. It was always marketing. But they're getting rid of the illusion. They're taking off the mask and showing the true face of the US empire and the blunt force, the bare fist of the US empire. As JD Vance himself said in the speech to US Naval Academy graduates, he says, when the US empire throws a punch, when it wages a war, it's going to be cautious, but it's going to be overwhelming and brutal and destroy everything.
That's how military power should be used, decisively with a clear objective. We ought to be cautious in deciding to throw a punch, but when we throw a punch hard, and we do it decisively, and that's exactly what we may ask you to do.
And of course, I should point out that it's obvious that the US empire is preparing for more war because Trump is boosting the US military budget to over $1 trillion per year. $1 trillion. Trump has boasted that he's increasing the military budget to the largest in the world and the largest in history.
And I'll be supporting a record-setting $1 trillion investment in our national defense. We're going to go $1 trillion, the largest in the world, largest ever in our country, but no other country's invested that much. We have a $1 trillion budget for military this year, and we have tremendous plans.
So if Trump were really moving away from interventionism and bringing back an isolationist foreign policy, Why would he be massively increasing the US military budget? He should be decreasing the US military budget. Because, of course, the reason is that Trump is not moving away from a warmongering, interventionist foreign policy. The US military has more than 700 foreign bases all around the world. Trump is not closing them all down to focus on US issues at home. In fact, Trump is doing the opposite. Trump has repeatedly pledged to expand the territory of the US empire. And really, if you want to summarize Trump's foreign policy, it's going back to a kind of 19th century style blatant imperialism. Trump wants to go back to the 19th century. He admires McKinley, the former US president, who was a blatant imperialist. Under McKinley, the US empire expanded significantly, and it colonized Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines, the Samoan Islands, and Hawaii. And in an executive order that Donald Trump signed on the day he returned to the White House on the 20th of January, Trump praised William McKinley for his, quote, expansion of territorial gains for the nation, end quote. And of course, Trump loves McKinley because he imposed very high tariffs. But this issue of territorial expansion of the US empire is very important for Trump. This is why repeatedly he has pledged to his supporters that he's going to expand the territory of the US empire.
The United States has the largest amount of oil and gas of any country on earth, and we may be a very substantially enlarged country in the not too distant. Isn't it nice to see, for years, for decades, we're the same size to the square foot, probably got smaller, actually. But we might be an enlarged country pretty soon.
And this is why Trump also promised in his inauguration speech that he will expand the territory of the US empire, and he invoked the colonial concept of manifest destiny, which was used by US colonialists in the 19th century to justify Western expansion and the theft of the territory of Native Americans.
And above all, China is operating the Panama Canal, and we didn't give it to China. We gave it to Panama, and we're taking it back. Like in 2017, we will again build the strongest military the world has ever seen. The United States will once again consider itself a growing nation, one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, builds our cities, raises our expectations, and carries our flag into new and beautiful horizons. And we will pursue our manifest destiny into the stars.
So all of this explains why the Trump administration has threatened to colonize Greenland and the Panama Canal and Gaza and even Canada. Because Trump and his Vice President JD Vance want to make the US empire as powerful as possible. They recognize that we're now in a multipolar world, and instead of acknowledging that the US empire is no longer the global hegemon, they want to prepare for war against China and maximize the influence and power of the US empire, especially in the Western Hemisphere. And top US officials have repeatedly invoked the Monroe Doctrine, which is an over 200-year-old colonial doctrine. So Trump and Vance are essentially saying the US empire owns the Western Hemisphere. Latin America and the Caribbean belong to the US empire in their imperialist view of the world. And another clear example of the kind of warmongering rhetoric that we hear from the Trump administration is that top US officials have tried to rebrand US soldiers as war fighters. This is a term that JD Vance used in his speech at the Naval Academy.
The tens of thousands of warfighters.
And this is also a term that is constantly used by Trump's defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, a former Fox News host who was made the head of the Pentagon. He's constantly talking about the US military's brave war fighters.
Ever since I've taken this position, the only thing I care about is doing right by the warfighters, by the troops. In short, we want the biggest, most badass military on the planet, on God's green earth.
So Trump wants the world to think that he's a peacemaker and he's against war, but his administration is rebranding US soldiers as war fighters. If they don't want to fight war, Why do they keep calling themselves war fighters? They're obviously preparing for war. Trump is not a peacemaker. It's just cynical PR. Another clear example of the Trump administration's warmongering is in the speech that JD Vance gave at the graduation of the U.S. Naval Academy. He boasted of the bombing of the so-called Houthis of the group Ansar Allah in Yemen, and he bragged that the U.S. military used overwhelming force.
And consider how this played out in just the last major conflict we engaged in with the Houthis over in the Middle East. We pursued that goal through overwhelming force against Houthi military targets.
In fact, JD Vance argued that Trump's war on Yemen established a clear red line and was a message, a threat to other countries that if the U.S. targets a country for war, it will use superior force and superior weapons to destroy them.
With the Trump administration, our adversaries now know when the United States sets a red line, it will be enforced. And when we engage, we do so with purpose, with superior force, with superior weapons, and with the best people anywhere in the world.
Now, the last thing that I'm going to say about this speech that JD Vance gave is that he made a very funny comment that is quite ironic if you know anything about the Trump administration. Vance claimed that the Trump administration is moving away from what he called ideological crusades and getting back to a hardline, direct, blunt foreign policy.
Now, that shift in thinking from ideological crusades to a principled foreign policy will help restore the credibility of American deterrence in 2025 and beyond.
That's hilarious because the Fox News host who is now serving as the defense secretary under Trump, Pete Hegseth, is a self-declared crusader. He is on an ideological crusade, proudly. In 2020, Trump's defense secretary published a book titled American Crusade, and he referred to this as a holy war. On the first page, he called it a holy war, proudly. And who is the target of this holy war? China, the international left, and also Islam, Muslims around the world. This is the guy who is running the military, the Pentagon, under Trump, while JD Vance, the U.S. Vice President, claims that the U.S. is moving away from ideological crusades. No, it's not actually. Instead, what the U.S. empire is doing is rebranding. It's dropping reference to democracy and human rights and the rules-based international order. No, it's getting rid of all of that propaganda, which was always fake, which is associated with the Democrats. And instead, Trump and Vance and the Republicans want to go back to a kind of blatant 19th century style imperialism, where they boast of how powerful the U.S. empire is and how it can destroy any adversary and beat up small countries like Yemen and bomb them in order to maximize the power of the U.S. empire, which Trump wants to physically expand by colonizing Gaza and Greenland and the Panama Canal and Canada and Mexico and who knows what other countries will be the next targets of the U.S. empire. That was the real goal of the speech that JD Vance gave at the graduation ceremony of the U.S. Naval Academy, announcing a new era of U.S. imperialism. And of course, the main target of the U.S. empire in this new era is China. This has been reiterated constantly by probably the second most powerful person in the U.S. government after Trump, who is Marco Rubio, who's now not only the Secretary of State that is overseeing U.S. foreign policy, but also he's the head of the U.S. National Security Council. He's the National Security Advisor. Marco Rubio is only the second person in U.S. history after Henry Kissinger to serve simultaneously as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. Rubio is a lifelong neoconservative war hawk, and he made it very clear in his Senate confirmation hearing that he sees China as the main target of the U.S. empire. And he says that basically everything in the 21st century is going to be based around the U.S. empire's new Cold War against China.
The Communist Party of China leads the PRC, is the most potent and dangerous near-peer adversary this nation has ever confronted. They have elements that the Soviet Union never possessed. They are a technological adversary and competitor, an industrial competitor, an economic competitor, a geopolitical competitor, a scientific competitor now, in every realm. It's an extraordinary challenge. It's one that I believe will define the 21st century. When they write the book about the 21st century, there's going to be some chapters in there about Putin. There's going to be some chapters in there about some of these other places. But the bulk of that book about the 21st century will be not just about China, but about the relationship between China and the United States and what direction it went.
If you want to know more about the US military's very serious preparations for war with China, in the description below, I will link to another report and a video that I did about how the Pentagon and also Silicon Valley big tech corporations are preparing for war on China. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will see you all next time.